racism is very highly charged, and it's difficult to have a rational and calm debate when individuals and institutions are being labeled racist or accused of indulging in so-called racist discourse. So it seems to me that we have to be particularly careful in how we use such words, and we have to be very clear about what we mean. A couple of points in advance. As has been mentioned, I've been editor-in-chief of the Gazette since November 2004. As a result, I was not at the newspaper during the period under discussion. Nevertheless, I'm quite ready to answer on behalf of the Gazette and to take responsibility for our current practices, which are not all that different really from what they were 5.5 years ago in September 2001. Second, while Dr. Perigoe spent 3.5 years putting the Gazette's coverage under a microscope, I do not have such luxury of time in formulating a response. I've not reviewed the entire content of the newspaper for the 20-day period under discussion. Rather, I've read Dr. Perigoe's presentation and the longer document that he sent me last year, and I've reviewed some key articles that appeared in the Gazette. Now, having heard Dr. Perigoe, you might wonder how I can possibly stand before you and take on the task of defending the Gazette's record in the weeks following 9/11. In fact, it was referred to several times with my courage and my bravery for being here. And indeed, when I first began familiarizing myself with this research, I had a sinking feeling that perhaps my newspaper had seriously disgraced itself at the time. But you'll surely be glad to hear that having looked fairly closely at the situation, I have no qualms at all about being in this position. I hope to show you that a fair review of the record, taken in context, will show that the Gazette can hold its head high, and that the suggestion that it engaged in an excess of so-called racist discourse is at the very least grossly overstated. In fact, I'll go further, and I'll say that such an accusation is irresponsible, ahistorical, and does nothing to foster constructive dialogue on the vital issues of media and minorities in society. I'll add right away that we certainly welcome well-founded and constructive criticism. As journalists, we live with some hard realities, hard daily realities. The hardest of all being that every night we must commit ourselves to print, knowing full well that we do not have all the facts on any important story. That the next morning can prove us wrong on any number of things that seemed quite clear the night before. And that a legion of second-guessers is always ready to measure our imperfect product against the standards of their own certainty. This is true every day. So imagine how truer it is in the context of 9/11, when we were all trying to sort through a welter of conflicting facts, opinions, and feelings. It is often stated casually that the media sets itself up as ready to criticize everyone else, but rejects criticism from others. If this was ever true, it is certainly not the case now. And I don't stand here saying that we are faultless or that we're not ready to entertain criticism. But let me turn now to some specifics. The first issue, and frankly I think it's really the key one here, is one of definition. Dr. Perigoe uses a definition of racism that is extremely broad, and you've heard him on that subject. He says that this is the standard understanding of racism in the communication studies field, and perhaps it is. But I believe that the definitions he uses, and just as important, the way he applies them, are so broad that he sweeps in whole categories of speech that most of us do not understand to be racist at all in any common sense meaning of the word. He's using what is essentially a heavily ideological definition of racism, which assumes, and I think he's pretty clear about this, that racism is baked into what we all unconsciously think and say. Now, I suppose he's free to adopt that definition, or any other, but we should be clear on what he's doing. And because of that, I think he's really engaged more in a critique of society in general than in a critique of a particular newspaper. Now, think about that a bit. In fact, by the kind of definition that he uses, I'm sure that almost any newspaper, magazine, TV network would be judged to engage in, quote, racist discourse. I think perhaps that by this definition, Concordia University itself, in its classrooms, in its administration, and its daily life, would also be implicated in racist discourse. According to this definition, I think perhaps all of us here in this room would be so implicated. Now, if so, isn't that highly relevant to this discussion and to his study? The Gazette has been judged and found wanting by what, to my mind, is a highly debatable standard, and one that has very little in common with most people's understanding of the word racism. Let's take a closer look at a few of the examples cited by Dr. Perigoe. One would assume that in summarizing his evidence for this audience, he would have included the most egregious examples he could find of so-called racist discourse in the Gazette that he could find, simply to drive home his point. In fact, he said that. He said that I've taken the worst examples here. So this is the worst. This is the worst he could find. Let's look at a couple. Well, the first was from September 14th, and he quoted it here. You know, you heard it. I heard, he said, one caller after another demand to get all those people out of there, all those damn foreigners. And let's just nuke the hell out of them. And the second example, also from September 14th, was let's kill them all rather. Let Allah sort it out. Now this certainly sounds bad, and I agree that it even sounds racist. I won't argue with that. Those statements did appear in the Gazette. But where did they appear? How did they appear? He made a reference to this, sort of in passing. He said, well, in parentheses, I'm going to mention this, although I don't think that necessarily really struck home with everybody here. So I'm going to talk about that a bit. These statements were included in an opinion column by Miriam Marquez of the Orlando Sentinel, who quoted them as examples of things that she had heard the day after the 9/11 attacks. Heard from her neighbors or heard on the radio. But I'm going to say I had written, here's an important point that Dr. Perigoe did not mention because it wasn't in his speech. He sort of mentioned it in passing, but I'm going to say it. Here's an important point to keep in mind that I think Dr. Perigoe brushed over best. Marquez quoted those statements precisely in order to reject them. In order to argue that we must overcome any negative feelings that came out of the attacks and resist any temptation to lash out at, quote, foreigners or minorities. And he quoted, oddly enough, but not in his speech, he quoted, oddly enough, what I'm going to now quote to you as an example of anti-racist discourse. It was written by her in the same column. She wrote, quote, the Arab community in this country, meaning the United States, is not our enemy. The terrorists, whoever they might be, are the enemy. These are trying times, she wrote, but we must resist the temptation to descend into the dark recesses of our hearts and slap everyone who looks a certain way or talks a certain way with a hateful label. We must not let our inner demons make us one of them, unquote. Now, this hardly sounds like racist discourse to me. In fact, interesting that Dr. Perigoe included it as anti-racist discourse. It sounds like someone pleading for understanding and mutual tolerance, only hours after a devastating attack on her country. And it was in the Gazette. But somehow, Dr. Perigoe sweeps this up into a grab bag of so-called racist discourse. He makes it Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2 in his parade of Gazette sins. And this doesn't make any sense to me. One might as well blame Dr. Perigoe himself for engaging in racist discourse, because he quoted those examples in his speech. I mean, that's about how relevant it is. He talks about naturalizing these feelings. Well, I'll say in parentheses that if we cannot speak about our feelings at all, even in the context of denouncing our negative feelings, then I don't know where we are. Now, the other examples he cites are from various news stories. And there's nothing at all in them that implies endorsement by the Gazette in any way, shape, or form. One of them involving an Associated Press story. One of them involving an Associated Press story, quoting a Republican politician saying insulting things about the one about people with diapers on their heads, right? Was included in a one-paragraph story that reported that that congressman was apologizing to the Arab community for making those remarks. This is a story which says that so-and-so said this and apologized for it. This becomes racist discourse, according to Dr. Perigoe. Now, it's obvious, I would have thought, that newspapers quote many people saying many things, including some violent and hurtful things, without endorsing those comments in any way. I sometimes find myself gently arguing with readers who get upset because we quote someone saying something that they find offensive. But I'm surprised to find myself arguing the same point in the context of a doctoral dissertation in communication studies. Dr. Perigoe says the examples he cites are racist. And he said that, quote, there was a lot of meanness out there to call upon, unquote. Well, no kidding. We're talking about the days immediately following 9/11, when emotions, particularly in the United States, were extremely charged. Now, is it not part of a newspaper's job to document, excuse my voice, to document in a responsible way the mood of the times? In this case, putting on record the fact that many people were getting very agitated and saying, quote, mean, unquote things. Does this amount, in and of itself, to racist discourse? I don't at all agree that it amounts to racism of any kind. And I don't think the Gazette has anything to apologize for simply reporting those remarks. If that is Dr. Perigoe's best evidence of the Gazette's alleged racism, then I think that we can all sleep okay at night. Now, on the issue of columns and commentary, Dr. Perigoe suggests that this was somehow worse because commentators have time to weigh their words. The examples he gives, I think, are extremely debatable, but none of them amounts, in my view, to racist discourse in any meaningful sense of the term. He quotes one columnist as writing, I am in the Place des Arts metro station. I see three men, one of them wearing a turban. I start to shake, unquote. You saw that. Once again, he completely ignores the context of the column, which was written by a freelance writer. The entire point of the column was that fear of the other, if you like, is unfounded, and that we need to relate to people, not as symbols of a foreign culture. I don't think it was a particularly good column, in fact, to be frank, but it was certainly not racist. On the contrary, it was a sincere, though perhaps confused effort to break through the symbolic barriers that can exist because of external things like turbans and hijabs. To lump this into so-called racist discourse is quite wrong and very misleading. Now, the two other examples of offensive columns that he quoted this evening are not, in my view, racist at all either. They simply express political opinions on the issues of immigration and terrorism with which Dr. Perigoe evidently disagrees. You can call them conservative opinions. You can call them right-wing opinions. You can call them anything you like. But I don't think they're racist. I think to call them racist is to misuse the language, and I think it's to mislead your audience. Now, Dr. Perigoe might well have quoted some other columns that Gazette ran during this period. One of them, published on September 18th, was a heartfelt plea not to give in to feelings of anger and retribution after the 9/11 attacks. It said in part, I'll quote it, he quoted a lot of things from the Gazette. Allow me to quote a couple. The column said, quote, in part, that understandable reflex, I sincerely fear, is going to cost us dearly in the coming weeks and months. The past 7 days have given rise to the worst instincts we have as human beings. And what we have spent hundreds of years trying to build, civilized societies founded on mutual respect, solidarity, and freedom, is in danger of collapsing as easily as the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. Another column from September 29th called on people not to dismiss the 9/11 attackers as mindless terrorists, but to examine their motives and to look at injustices around the world that might have fueled the attacks. The writer said in part, quote, here's the hardest thing to accept. Here's the hardest thing to accept, that there may sometimes even be some kind of truth behind what someone like Saddam Hussein says. Facts are facts, whoever says them. And it is a fact, the writer went on, that the United States is responsible for more than a little of the blood that has been shed in recent years, both directly and by supporting others who shed it. The truth is in the numbers, unquote. But Dr. Perigoe doesn't mention those columns. He doesn't quote from those columns. He quotes only from columns with which he disagrees, and he finds, quote, racist. Well, so no wonder his study gives the impression that the Gazette was awash in such commentary, when he fails even to mention anything on the other side of the debate. I mean, to be fair, he did mention, he said there were 22 statements. Well, I mean, I must say, I've got a sheaf of things here. I could find 22 statements. I could find 100 or 150 or 500 statements that I call anti-racist. Give me about 24 hours to do it, because in the few hours that I spent doing it, I found any number of those things. But I wasn't part of the team rating racist and non-racist. So finally, Dr. Perigoe suggests that the Gazette minimized the extent and seriousness of the attacks against Muslims, and therefore failed to defend our fellow citizens. I cannot tell you how absurd I find this. In the days following 9/11, as I'm sure you'll all remember, public figures, clergy of all stripes, opinion leaders of every variety, newspapers, including the Gazette, repeatedly warned against any temptation to blame Muslims in general, and especially the Muslims living among us in Montreal and Canada, for the events in New York City. Everyone was on guard against the possibility of a backlash against Muslims. The Gazette ran an editorial on September 14, 2001, condemning the anti-Muslim acts that had occurred elsewhere, and stating that, quote, Muslims are right to point out that Islam and the Quran in no way condone the horrific acts committed this week, quote. In another editorial the following day, the Gazette quoted and endorsed this remark from the French Prime Minister, quote, we are not at war against Islam or the Arab world, end quote. Now closer to home, we ran numerous articles, and I have a bunch of them here, about Muslims and Arabs speaking out against the 9/11 attacks and warning of the possibility of a backlash. We carried articles quoting religious leaders of all faiths calling for tolerance, about schools making sure Muslim students were safe, and about people from all communities standing together at various ceremonies and events. It is completely wrong for Dr. Perigoe to claim, as he does, that the Gazette did not fight what he refers to as, quote, the tendency to lash out against the nearest person associated with the violence of Montreal Muslims, unquote. None of the evidence that he has assembled could lead a fair-minded person to such a conclusion. Now, as you may recall, the expected backlash against Muslims was not as widespread as some people feared it might be. On September 15th, we quoted Salam El-Manyawi, chairman of the Muslim Council of Montreal, who is here with us tonight. Hello. Quoted him as saying, one of many times we quoted him in those days, many times, quoted him as saying that there had been only a few, quote, isolated incidents, unquote, in the Montreal area, and saying that community relations remained excellent in Montreal. For some reason, though, Dr. Perigoe is convinced that there was a wave of anti-Muslim activity that the Gazette willfully ignored. Quotes a police report to support this contention. It's impossible for us to know, based on that simple number, how serious those incidents were, when they happened, and how, if any, how they came to light, if at all. Why on earth would he assume that the Gazette would ignore or minimize any serious anti-Muslim incidents at a time when they were extremely newsworthy, and we were all on the lookout for such activities? I think he's making some very ungenerous assumptions and assuming the worst motives possible on the basis of very flimsy evidence, and I must say I do find that disappointing. Now let me address the issue of diversity in newsrooms. And here I do find myself largely in agreement with Dr. Perigoe. I'm glad we do have something to agree on. The Gazette and other newspapers have not done a good job in assuring that visible minorities are adequately represented on our staffs, and that is a real problem. There are a number of reasons for this. In the past, we did not cast our recruiting net wide enough to ensure that the best possible selection of candidates was available for job openings. There was a lot of cronyism and hiring people who look like yourself. I would agree with that in the past. Nowadays, we face the difficult issue of a shrinking workforce. The newspaper industry, as you know, is challenged. We are not a growing business. So the opportunities to recruit new talent are few and far between. Quite naturally, older and less diverse employees are reluctant to step away from well-paid and secure jobs in order to make room for others. Now, this is not a problem unique to the newspaper industry. I'm glad that Dr. Perigoe himself makes the point that the issue of diversity is just as real and present for the Concordia University Journalism Department as it is for the Gazette, and essentially for the same reasons. I could make a contribution, I'll say this in parentheses, to diversity by stepping down from my position on the explicit assumption from my publisher that I would be replaced by somebody, of diverse background. I could make that contribution. Dr. Perigoe could make a contribution to diversity in the journalism department of Concordia University by stepping down on the explicit assumption that a person, a visible minority person, take his place. I'm not quite ready to do that yet, and I don't think he is either. In a nutshell, that's a large part of the problem. Okay? In my brief time at the Gazette, this is an area I totally agree that we can do better. In my brief time at the Gazette, we have been able to recruit talented people of diverse backgrounds, including Muslims, but there is a long way to go. Now, my final thought is, and this may sound a bit harsh, but I think we have a wasted opportunity here. There's certainly room for a thoughtful, detailed, and uncompromising critique of how the Gazette and other newspapers performed in the aftermath of 9/11. It would be fascinating to know, for example, whether the Gazette accurately reflected its audience, was ahead of them in the sense of being more enlightened, or lagged behind. It would be interesting to know how the Gazette performed in comparison to any other news outlet or any public institution. I would welcome such a study. Unfortunately, the study we're discussing tonight addresses none of these questions and does not, in my view, I'm afraid to say, make much of a contribution to understanding the issues of concern to all of us. Thanks very much.